and it's in the breaking we come unbound. And it's in the giving we are found. Yeah, you could barely change.
Welcome to A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, a podcast dedicated to the telling of authentic stories and the sharing of insightful wisdom, exploring science and spirituality, medicine and Mother Nature. No topic is off limits when it comes to growing our personal understanding and supporting our collective well-being. With your host, Dr. Rob Abbott, a family medicine resident practicing spiritually focused and evolutionarily informed functional medicine, we hope to nourish your being so that you can flourish in whatever the moment has called for you to do.
And I know you tried.
In episode 46 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being, I welcome two guests and my new close friends, Dr. Tommy Wood and Christopher Kelly of Nourish Balance Thrive. Between the two of them, Tommy and Chris have been helping burned-out athletes achieve both optimal performance and wellness through a combination of targeted testing, nutritional approaches, and selective augmentation. The two have helped thousands of athletes and are constantly providing nourishing content, no pun intended, to thousands more via their NBT podcast. Additionally, Tommy puts out an incredible weekly review, a highlights email that will leave you with more to chew on than just your thumbs. In this episode, we start the conversation exploring the origin stories of Chris and Tommy, finding their way into the ancestral health space. They both offer descriptions of the path that led them to their current work, in addition to more specific details regarding the nature of their education and scholastic backgrounds. We then explore the birth of Nourish Balance Thrive and discuss in depth the vision, passion, and ethos behind this unique and innovative initiative. Chris offers a personal look into his own leap of faith starting the business, followed by the quick collaboration with bright and curious minds like Tommy. We then get into the meat of the discussion, the newest technological feat between the two and their partner in crime, naturopathic physician and biochemistry extraordinaire, Dr. Bryan Walsh. Chris and Tommy describe their blood chemistry calculator, a universal tool utilizing machine learning and incorporating data from thousands of athletes that can actually predict nutritional status, blood sugar regulation, and even potential xenobiotic exposure from just a handful of laboratory markers. While still early in its implementation, this calculator has the ability to transform medical care and functional medicine testing. And you will hear from both of them how they see it being optimally used and explored. Combining perspectives for both clinicians and the lay audience, Tommy offers some great reasons why machine learning and this blood chemistry calculator should be on your radar. We then end the podcast with Tommy sharing a little of his background, leading the innovative group Physicians for Ancestral Health, an organization of which I am proudly affiliated. Tommy shares some of the vision and initiatives of this group and how he hopes to expand its reach in the months and years to come. I still cannot fully believe I was able to share this conversation with Tommy and Chris, having listened to the two over many years during my own incubation and exploration of ancestral and functional health. I'm extremely excited to share this conversation with you all. And please be sure to explore the podcast show notes and links to their page, podcast, and the blood chemistry calculator. You certainly won't be disappointed. And with that, let's dig into the show. Well, Tommy and Chris, thank you so much for joining me today for a podcast. I am probably like a little giddy schoolgirl, just so excited to get to talk to you, to the two of you, having kind of followed you guys for a while and still can't believe I'm having a podcast with you guys. So thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for having us. We're very happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I can't believe that anyone would say that because I still feel like that now, and I've been doing this several years now.
So thank you guys, again for coming on, and we'll try for the listeners, at least in the beginning, they're probably hearing a few different voices and like, well, I know one is Rob, but I don't know about these other two. So maybe we'll start with some introductions, and Tommy, you can go first and probably let people know a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'll give the short version, then you can always ask more questions if you want. I'm obviously British and half Icelandic, if anybody's interested. But I grew up mainly in the UK, which is where I did most of my training. So I have a bachelor's undergraduate degree in biochemistry. Then I went to medical school, which is not the usual way round in the UK. In the UK, normally you go straight to medical school from high school, and it's a 5 to 6 year process to get a medical degree. But I did a sort of a graduate version, which is similar to the US system. And then I worked as a doctor in London for a couple of years, right in the centre of London. And after that, there's sort of a natural break in training in the UK after your first 2 years. It's basically like 2 years of a cross between an internship and a first year or two of residency, and you rotate through lots of departments as a junior doctor. So I did that, and then that's when you start to specialise in the UK system. So at that point, I actually took a break. I was offered a PhD position. I went to do a PhD in physiology and neuroscience at the University of Oslo in Norway. And then during that time, sort of on the side, I started to do or dig more into my interest in terms of more holistic or systematic approaches to health. Started a blog, my own podcast. Heard Chris on a podcast, reached out to him, and then sort of we ended up interacting more and more, and then working together. And now I'm based in Seattle. And I've just finished a postdoc period doing research at the University of Washington. So I'm now a full-time, quack/entrepreneur online, doing all this kind of stuff in terms of trying to optimize health and performance in athletes as well as in patients with chronic disease.
Well, you are a pretty dang qualified online quack, if that's what you're going to call yourself. You've been in school for ages and ages. So, perhaps just before we move to Chris, put that again in perspective in terms of the amount of time you've been in school to theoretically do what it is you're doing now.
Yeah, so I used to joke that I basically spent my entire life as a student, and I think that's even if you're not actually a student, sort of having that mindset is very important. So what I did, 3 years as a university as undergraduate, then 4 years in medical school, and then 3 years as in a PhD. I did a 4-year PhD in 3 years, not to brag or anything, but so I guess that 10 years of formal education with some time working as a doctor in between, and then when I worked as a postdoc, so that's technically continued training for another year and a half after I finished my PhD. So yeah, it's a good 10 to 12 years of an educational process to try and to get to this point where I am today.
Yeah, that's an incredible journey. I mean, I know I have some of my friends who have gone the sort of, medical degree, medical doctor to PhD route, and the amount of years that they put into research and the periods in between research and actual clinical medicine can be quite lengthy and cause major disruptions in just how you're approaching the world. And there's people joke about the MD PhDs because they often think very differently than the traditional MDs just because of the time away from medicine and doing research. So, but thank you for putting that in perspective, and really just excited to get some of your insights during all of that journey and this continued journey that you're on to really kind of unpack a new term that I like, systematic medicine. I like that idea of sort of a in-depth and almost intuitive approach. So thanks for that introduction.
Yeah.
Now, let's move on to Chris. I think you probably have a little bit of a different story, but one that's quite wonderful to hear, and would love for you to introduce yourself and a little bit about you.
Well, thank you. I've got a little bit of CV envy over here. Not nearly so much time studying medicine. In fact, zero time studying medicine. My background is in electronics and also in computer science. My undergraduate degree in computer science is from Southampton University. I'm obviously British too. and I've been living in the US for 15 years now. And in fact, Facebook gave me one of those reminders recently that it was 4 years since I left my job at a hedge fund and started Nourish Balance Thrive. And when I did that, I thought, well, how bad can this be? You're a computer programmer, you live in Silicon Valley. Like, what's the worst that can happen? Maybe, and how long is it going to take to get another job? Probably 2 weeks. So why not just go for it? And so here I am, 4 years later, going stronger than ever, surrounded by brilliant people far better than me, and just having a ton of fun. But just to backtrack a bit, how I got here was, I guess it would have been, well, it's hard to say when it started. So I think I've made some really poor decisions with my diet and lifestyle since early childhood. And all of that came to a head when I moved from London. I was working for Yahoo in London, and they moved me over to Silicon Valley. And I started becoming interested in competitive cycling that got more and more competitive. I hired a coach. I did all the things that the coach said I should do. I ate more carbohydrates. I trained longer and harder. I spent tons of time in that kind of gray zone where you're not really going flat out and you're not really going slowly. And I did get faster. I started off as a Cat 2 mountain biker, which is, pretty middle of the road, weekend warrior type thing, and made my way up to Cat 1, and then eventually got my pro license. But in the course of doing all that, my health just completely fell apart. And of course, it wasn't just the exercise, it was the diet, it was the lifestyle, it was everything. And that forced me to start looking for solutions. And so I did what anyone would do. I went to my primary care doctor and reported that I had a ton of fatigue. I wasn't sleeping well. I had mild depression. I had zero interest in women. I had erectile dysfunction. And the doctor said, oh, well, this is what happens to athletes. And this is to be expected. But you're still in great shape. You look much better than I do. And you certainly look better than the people in the waiting room. But yeah, I can see you've got some GI symptoms, so let me refer you to a gastroenterologist. And so I went to see the gastroenterologist, and the gastroenterologist told me that it was nothing to do with my diet, and that they could do some testing involving putting cameras up both ends, and that would confirm what I'd already told the gastroenterologist. And once that confirmation was in, they had some steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, and when those stopped working, and I was told they would stop working, that there was surgery for me. And I was lucky enough that I just met the woman who is now my wife, and she had just finished a master's degree in food science, and she'd been studying food allergies in the lab. And so she was very familiar with some of the foods that may be causing an allergic response. And she said, oh, you should probably try an elimination diet before you try any of those things that the gastroenterologist recommended. And I said, sure, why not? What's the harm in that? What's the worst that could happen here? And so I did an elimination diet. That elimination diet was the autoimmune paleo protocol. So I removed bread, pasta, most of the things that I loved and was fueling my endurance activity on from my diet, along with some things that can be quite nutrient-dense foods, but cause people some problems, especially the people we see. And those are eggs and nuts and seeds and nightshades. And I knew it was working because I'd done a bunch of blood testing with my primary care doctor. And one of the things he measured was C-reactive protein, which is an acute phase reactant and a marker of inflammation. And mine went down from, I believe it was like 7 around that sort of area, down to less than 0.5 in about 2 weeks after I changed my diet. And so that really gave me the impetus to really try and understand what exactly was going on. Like, why was this elimination diet working? If I feel this much better just after an elimination diet, what else might be possible? And that eventually led me to Dan Chelation and his Institute of Functional Medicine. I worked with him for a time, and he did some tests on me. He found an amoebic infection. He found bacterial overgrowth. He found yeast overgrowth. He found a pinworm infection. He found all kinds of fun stuff. And I took a whole bunch of supplements that he recommended. And my belly, which at the time was like a basketball, I was super lean. It was like not possible to measure subcutaneous fat on me. The coach had tried to do it with calipers, and there was just nothing there to measure. It was literally not even on the chart. But I still had this basketball where my belly was, and it was all just gas. And I took a whole bunch of aromatic herbs, like garlic and oregano and all of that stuff. And it just deflated over the period of a few days. And it was such an amazing experience. And, the whole time my sleep is getting better. I can remember I nearly cried the first time I slept the whole night without getting up to eat a bowl of cereal. My libido came back. That was amazing. And so I was able to sustain a stable relationship, and I felt that my mood changed. I think it was no coincidence that I ended up marrying this woman that made this initial intervention that allowed me to recover my health. I think mentally I was just a totally different person. I think I was scared and I was depressed and just not a very nice person to be around. And at that point I thought, well, shit, like how many other athletes have been affected by problems like this? Am I the only one? Am I some sort of special flower? And so I got together with a local medical doctor, and we were the perfect yin and yang, really, because she at the time had just finished her residency and had started a job as a primary care practitioner locally here in the Bay Area in California, and was really not that happy with her work. You start work on Monday morning and you're going to see 30 patients in the next 6 hours, and you think, really? What am I going to do? How am I going to fix these people in 7 minutes or whatever it is? And at the same time, she's got $250,000 of student debt. There's no way out of this now. You really have to put in the hours in order to pay off all this debt. And so, is there a better way? And we went on to the Rob Wolf podcast and the Ben Greenfield podcast and told the exact story that I just told you now. And it turned out that a lot of athletes have been affected by the same thing that I've been affected by. And those people came forward to us and said, hey, here's my credit card number. Whatever the hell you did, just write it down and send it to me because, send me the supplements. I want the exact supplements you took. I want the exact thing that you did. And that was what launched Nourish Balance Thrive. And like I said, that's 4 years ago now. And we've had well over 1,000. It's been a while since I counted, actually, but I know it's well over 1,000 athletes have been through our program now. And
that's incredible.
I feel like we're approaching the problem at more angles than ever before. And we're all having a ton of fun and getting great results, just helping athletes achieve their full potential.
I've heard that story before, as you mentioned on those podcasts, hearing them live as part of that journey of you sort of discovering and reaching out to folks. And I remember hearing it myself because, I can't even call myself really an athlete, but I was certainly one of those individuals. I mean, when I was into college and into medical school, I was just riding my bike in that gray zone pretty much everywhere. That was my stress relief. And it felt like it, right? It felt like it was, helping me to do all this work in the emergency room and this really rigorous schoolwork and through college and undergrad. And but it just slowly but surely just started to wear on me. And I entered into a doctor's office just like you, Chris. I, had no interest in women, no really interest in friendships. I was depressed. Was just really fatigued, and on the surface, I'm like, what's really wrong with me? And they kind of looked at me and ran some tests and kind of said the same thing. And it was really just kind of a hamster wheel until finally I kind of had this epiphany of I just need to stop this. So you are totally on point when you say, there's so many other people out there who have had similar experiences. And at the time too, I thought I was doing all the right things. I thought I was eating the right types of foods and was fueling my body with all the carbs that it needed for that activity. And the reality was I was just tearing my body apart with inflammation. And so thank you for sharing that. And I hope you never stop. It may start to get old as you go on, but please never stop sharing that story, because to me, it's the why behind the why. That's really what I think people, and what I resonate with in really this storytelling is discovering that why behind the why, because really that's at the end of the day, the real motivation and why people will resonate with your mission. So thank you, Chris. I guess I can stick with you and maybe we can go a little into some of the main topics I wanted to cover for today. You mentioned Nourish Balance Thrive and sort of the origins of that group, and Tommy mentioned as well, sort of reaching out to you and developing this partnership. But really wanted you to share maybe very concretely, what is your sort of current mission, and what are some areas that how you've evolved since the beginning?
Yeah, so as I said before, we help athletes achieve their full potential, and by full potential, I don't just mean their athletic potential, I just mean their full potential in life, right? Athletes are human beings too, and it's just generally not an acceptable thing to just be good at a single thing like pedaling a bicycle. It's just not good, and I don't think anyone really wants that anyway. And interestingly, for my story, you know, I was really good on the bike. I was winning races at the weekend, but I couldn't even hold my concentration together to write a single line of code. You know, I was lucky I was working this job at a hedge fund where they didn't really ask me to do any work. And so, you know, days, weeks, even months would pass without me doing anything at all. Just sitting there, you know, reading articles, and that was about it. And even then I wasn't really reading them. So, I mean, when I say full potential, I mean full potential in all areas of life. And the way that we do that is primarily with diet and lifestyle coaching. And so not everybody needs to eat the autoimmune protocol. I'm not trying to suggest here that this is the one true diet and this is what all of our athletes are eating. That's certainly not the case. But most of the athletes that come to us, they do need to optimize their diet in some way. And we do use elimination diets very frequently in recovering our athletes' health and improving their performance. So that's an important part of it. But then also there are lots of other lifestyle factors that we take into consideration. So obviously sleep. We spend a lot of time talking about sleep. And then also appropriate stress management, right? We don't try and reduce stress. We just try and help our athletes respond to it better. And then also sunshine. I'm stood outside in the sunshine in California right now. And social support is a very important thing. I think sometimes the problems, they are a vicious cycle. So when you don't feel good and you feel sort of depressed and tired, you don't really feel like going out and making friends. And we know that social isolation is a real problem for all humans, let alone someone who's feeling kind of tired and slightly depressed. And then what else? Optimizing training plans, right? Not spending so much time in that gray zone. And yeah, I feel like we've got a really fantastic team now that optimizes all of these things from various different angles. And then, you know, the final really important part of our program is the use of biomedical tests to take a look inside of the athletes. And so as an engineer, as I was sat in that GP's office, I thought, look, if I was interviewing you for an engineering job, I wouldn't take this conversation any further. You know, I'd politely say thank you for coming and show you the door, because it seems to me that you're not really thinking in terms of complex systems and understanding root causes at all, which is something that all engineers do on a daily basis. And the tools we have to do that root cause analysis are blood chemistry, urinary organic acids. We look at urinary hormones. We do lots of stool testing. We do PCR DNA analysis on stool, and then also traditional stool cultures. And so it goes on. And so we look inside of the athletes, and we quite often find nutrient deficiencies, infections, things that are very fixable using either the diet and lifestyle interventions and then also nutritional supplements as well.
Yeah, you know, I would love to, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later after get some input from Tommy. I would love to sort of get your thoughts. I went to the University of Virginia for medical school and had a little bit of time working with the primary care physicians who worked with the athletes. And they were doing some fairly innovative things in terms of recovery. I had sort of introduced and trying to see, they were doing like GPS monitoring and accelerometers for some of the basketball players. And I don't think they were doing HRV at the time. But it just seemed like this has to be, if someone like yourself or like Tommy was connected to a college or university or these pro teams who are really looking to optimize. I know, I'm forgetting her name, that I guess it's Dr. Kate Shanahan. I guess she has done some stuff with like the LA Lakers. But I've been sitting there and I'm like, maybe I don't know about it and people keep it secret, but there's got to be folks in this ancestral space sort of tuned into some of these tests who are looking at optimization, who've got to be working with some of these college teams or pro teams. And so I would love to maybe we'll go there in a little bit to see if that's something you guys are doing. But I do want to give Tommy a little bit of time because he's been so patient on the sides here. And you gave us a good intro to behind your background in medicine and this incredible journey that you've been on. But something also tells me that you're now sort of invested in this integrative medicine space. But really, where did all of this begin in terms of your interest in medicine? Was it, do you have parents or siblings or people that you looked up to, or what was your first experience with medicine as a child?
So actually, the first real experience I had was when I broke a number of bones jumping off a wall when I was on my 12th birthday, in fact. And my mum was certain there was nothing wrong with me, and I went to the hospital, and then I got some X-rays, and she finally actually agreed that I had 4 broken metatarsals. So maybe there was something wrong with me.
Maybe you did something.
Yeah, and I think that's a good first real experience, because that's something that modern medicine is good at, right? Orthopedics, broken bones, surgeries, trauma. Acute illnesses. That's actually something that modern medicine is very good at, and we want to continue it being good at. And when I sort of got into this other side of stuff, it was, I don't know, I've always been, or actually I wasn't always, but getting towards the end of my teenage years, I suddenly became interested in health, and mainly from an aesthetic point of view. I was kind of an overweight kid, didn't really like exercise that much, and then, I'm 18, I get dumped, and I'm like, well, if I get a 6-pack, maybe, maybe she'll love me again, and which is nonsense. But when you're a teenager, that's the way you think, and actually people continue to think that way for a large part of their lives, and there's a conversation that we have with our athletes fairly frequently. But so then I got into...
That's a good point.
Yeah. And I got into sort of health and wellness that way, and I started rowing at university, and then I started coaching rowing, and I wanted to more about how to train and how to fuel that training, and sort of found some stuff about CrossFit. This is in the early 2000s, so right when CrossFit was just sort of starting, and at that point it was associated with Rob Wolf, so then there was some stuff about the paleo diet. Of course, they went down the zone route later on, for better or worse. But at the time, so then kind of got into Rob Wolf, read some of the paleo stuff, and it was interesting. And I kind of, because I'd been doing, I was doing a degree in biochemistry, I kind of felt like even though Rob is a biochemist, the biochemistry within the book was a bit light for my personal taste. So I was like, okay, yeah, it's interesting. And then sort of went on the back burners for a while. But when I was at medical school, my mum basically got married again to my now stepdad, and my stepbrother, who's exactly the same age as me, has multiple sclerosis. And my stepdad is a chemical engineer, and I am about to be married to a chemical engineer, and I know that what they are very good at is solving problems. So basically, he figured multiple sclerosis is just a problem with a system. The system is broken. We find the problem, the weak points in the system, and then we can fix them. And that hence a sort of a systematic approach. And so he taught me how to think about systems like an engineer would, or, at least as much as I could learn it in that sort of informal context. And we basically figured out a load of stuff that is potentially important for autoimmune diseases, and then health in general. And then eventually becomes obvious that that's important for performance in general. But it's sleep, stress, diet, toxin exposures, chronic infections, all that kind of stuff that we talk about now, nutrients and nutrient deficiencies, and what it takes to sort of make a human healthy again is actually very similar to what it takes to make a human perform optimally in a sport. And that's sort of like an evolution over time, but that's what really got me interested in that stuff. And then when I started my PhD, I had some more time. I was basically on a computer in front of PubMed all day, and then sometimes I strayed over into the health side of things, or more directly into the health human application side, and things sort of really grew from there. But that's I guess that experience of sort of looking at a disease and taking it apart in a systematic manner was really sort of what got me interested in this kind of road that I've gone down since.
Yeah, wow. I had not heard that story before, and it's a great contrast. I love how you sort of had that traumatic experience, breaking all these bones, and as you said, sort of that's what we do quite well in Western medicine, is those acute events. For the most part, I will say I did bust the crap out of one of my fingers playing baseball, and had terrible care until the very end when I found a hand orthopedist. But in general, that's what we do very well. And then you bring up multiple sclerosis, and autoimmune condition that we have very little for. And actually, interestingly, kind of an aside, I've just been following fairly recently a couple of medicines that they've been using as sort of suppressants to the immune system, and multiple sclerosis have had major questions of their toxicity. And are starting to be even recalled from the FDA. So it's interesting that you brought up MS. But the fact is this dichotomy of what we have experience with and good treatments for, there's a huge divide in medicine, and most often we're not taking the systematic approach that you're sort of describing, looking at the systems involved in this problem. So it's to me, it makes complete sense that the two of you have sort of come together, these very similar minds, one, very sort of medical background, and the other in this, engineering background, but you guys think in systems. And I think, I know Rob Wolf's talked about before, he's had people on his podcast talking about engineers or like physicists and these types of folks who think in this sort of problem-based manner are the ones solving some of these major problems. And I couldn't agree more with him.
And I should add actually that, had it not been for that acute care system, I never would have been old enough to even have any of the chronic problems that I ended up having, because I was, as a 19-year-old, I was in a motorcycle accident where I tore my carotid artery out of my neck and had emergency surgery, a vein grafted from my leg to replace the damaged artery. And I would have never have survived that had it not been for modern medicine, right? So, although I tell this story where I bash up gastroenterologists and the like, it's like I just never would have been there to even ask them in the first place had it not been for, doctors 20 years earlier.
Yeah. No, and I think all of us here agree in this sort of integrative, when I use the term integrative, is bringing all of these specialties, because in certain moments you need that trauma specialist.
Right.
And I would never in a heartbeat take their job or the amount of time it takes to get to that level of expertise. It's not for me, but I'm so grateful for the people who do that work. So thank you for kind of putting that perspective in as well, Chris. I was curious, wanted to maybe step back a little bit, and maybe, Tommy, you could provide some initial insights about this, application of these services. And Chris, you mentioned you've had maybe over 1,000 athletes go through this process, and kind of in general what this process looks like. And like I said, I kind of speculating like, well, why isn't this a bigger thing? Are there professional teams or college teams doing this? I was curious, Tommy, if you've are currently involved or been approached or know of anyone who's working in this regard, because it just sounds like, for lack of a better reason, financially, it would be a pretty big incentive for someone to maybe invest in something or explore something like this when it comes to athletics.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sort of, I guess the answer to, are people doing this? It's definitely yes and no. So I know that. So I was recently joined the board, the scientific advisory board, the science board of a company called Hinsa Performance, and they do a lot of corporate wellness stuff. That's probably where they make the most of their money, but they're sort of blue ribboned. The part of their business is that they provide the coaching and nutrition support for Formula One drivers. And so I've worked with a number of the drivers now, and I think particularly in terms of motorsport in general, there's one thing where they focus very much on the performance of the vehicle, because that's obviously they're all engineers, and that's where they sort of their expertise comes from. But optimizing the performance of the driver, and I don't think this is specific to any one motorsport, so I don't want to call anyone out. I just think that that's just what I've seen so far. That's focused on less, which is surprising really, because you have this incredibly powerful machine, and then you need to make sure that the brain that's driving it is functioning as well as possible. And some people are starting to change that, and they're certainly doing some of the tests that we talk about. They're doing advanced blood biochemistry, they're doing organic acids. Some of the teams have performance centers where they're doing this kind of stuff, and I think now maybe it's something that's not yet universal, or maybe people aren't quite sure what to do with the data when they get it. They sort of know that it's useful data, but they're not really sure how to intervene, and a lot of the systems currently look like you'll do a test and there's an output, and then the output just sort of like gives this bulk recommendation of a load of supplements to take. And it's just kind of like, this is high, this is low, take this. And that's certainly beneficial to a point, but there's a lot more nuance there that I think people could learn and would benefit from. And in terms of, so say the collegiate sport level, I think so. I have been approached by a couple of guys who are certainly very interested in the kind of stuff that we do, but it becomes very tricky because there are medical teams and dietitian teams associated with a university or a college, and traditional dietetics and nutrition maybe isn't quite the realm which we're functioning in, just because they're still working on essentially outdated information. And that's just, for all of their goodwill, I think that's the case. We're talking about, hundreds, thousands of grams of carbohydrate per day, usually very, highly refined, very little talk about micronutrition, and just all of this stuff is kind of embedded into their culture. And it's, almost impossible for an outsider like me to come in and say, well, hang on a second, what all of your dietitians are saying is just wrong. Do what I say instead.
Yeah.
That's just like understandably nobody's going to be very receptive to that. So I think there's a lot of improvement that could be made there. Certainly as you set people up, either, you have these kids who say they're playing football and they're getting concussed and then, eating a highly refined diet directly afterwards, massive spikes in blood sugar around a TBI, probably not a great idea. And, so you're setting them up for failure if they just go out into the real world. And, even more so if they're then going to become a professional and they have, 2 or 3 years of competing whilst abusing their body from multiple directions. And then, they're kind of stuck for life after that. So there's definitely a lot that could be improved there. And I think people are starting to think about it. But, for all of those reasons, it's going to be sort of a slow uptake.
Yeah, Chris, wanted to get your insights into this arena.
Yeah, I mean, amongst the people that I race with, I still do some bike racing. It's just completely unknown. Like, nobody knows how to use a blood test to improve their performance. Maybe I'm a little naive, but certainly amongst the weekend warriors and the masters athletes, I don't think they're thinking about this stuff. And it's just, why would they? I mean, so when you look at, the Formula One is a great metaphor, actually, because so much effort goes into understanding what exactly is going on inside of the car at any moment. They have real-time telemetry, right? They know what's going on inside the car all the time. But that car was engineered by people who did unit tests as they were building that system from the bottom up, and they knew exactly whether it was working or not using some of these tests that they developed. And so when it stops working or they want to monitor the performance of the car in real time, then they go right back to the test that they used when they were engineering the thing in the first place. Whereas the human system, there are no such unit tests, right? The human was just here. Like, we never designed it in that way.
Yeah.
So, why would you? But I think it's going to become, especially, maybe later on we'll talk about some of these machine learning techniques. One of the barriers to entry is the cost of what we're doing. We're spending an awful lot of money on mass spectrometry in the athletes that we work with. And so, how could you do that if you were, a high school or college team where you've got potentially hundreds or even thousands of people? Like, how could you couldn't do, $5,000 of mass spec on every single one of your athletes. It's just out of your financial reach.
Yeah, I remember doing some of that calculation in my own head, thinking about some of the urine organic acids and some of these sort of micronutrient-based testing. And in my mind, I was like, what's going to take? It's going to take some old alumni who's super invested in the football team, who's got a ton of money and just is like, kind of like a SpaceX mindset of like, let's go for the moon and invest in some kind of little pilot project. That was what I told myself in my head. But you're right; it adds up really quickly in terms of some of these specialized tests. Not that they're not beneficial, as you guys have been proving, but if you're trying to scale that, at least right now where it's at, it's going to be quite difficult to do. And so it'll be interesting to see what area some pilot project like this comes out, or to see how it might get applied. But I agree, there's some major challenges in place in multiple levels. And I agree that sort of Formula One analogy is a pretty good one too. How much energy are we putting into the team dynamics or the dynamics of the vehicle or the equipment, and as compared to the person.
And then how well would the car go if it had even a minor problem? Like, imagine, one of the tires on a Formula One car was missing 5 psi, so the tire was a bit soft. Like, what would you expect that to do to the performance of a Formula One car? It'd be devastating, right? So, the same is true of the elite athletes that we work with, that they just can't afford to be racing and training with a few psi missing from one of their tires. Whereas somebody who is not performing at that level, an old Cadillac, sure, you can drive around with a few psi missing out one of the tires. You probably won't even notice it, right? So, it's going to be dependent on the person and what they're up to at that time.
Yeah. Well, Chris, you mentioned some of the blood chemistry that you guys do with some of your athletes. And we've been kind of in the realm of the athlete initially in some of this description. But you guys have come up with something that really is revolutionizing how we approach blood chemistry. And you guys had a great podcast on your show. I guess it was back at the end of January, maybe early February, where you sort of debuted this technology, and wanted to maybe go and spend some time here at the end really describing this new blood chemistry calculator that you're making, because I think it's going to be, as I previously said, revolutionary to this entire industry, both for sort of the layperson and for athletes.
Awesome.
So Chris or Tommy, do you want to start by describing how this was developed, or give us a little background to the blood chemistry calculator?
Do you want to take that, Tommy? I think you can do a good job on that.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I think a lot of this started in the absence of any input from me. So it kind of begins with Bryan Walsh, who is brilliant, and we will make sure that you get him on your show because he's awesome. And he's an ND and a naturopathic doctor, and he is just exceptional at understanding biochemistry and physiology and then teaching it as well. He has a website called Metabolic Fitness Pro, where he has these amazing courses on interpreting blood chemistry, and there's definitely more to come from him there. He has some courses on blood sugar control and on detoxification, just incredibly evidence-based and very thorough and very well explained. And basically, at one point, he wanted to systematize what he saw as patterns in blood chemistry. So obviously, if you had a set of blood tests done, what you really wanted was Bryan to interpret it for you. But obviously, there's only so much Bryan to go around. And he figured, some way to build some algorithms that could sort of, even if it's just like if this, then this, if this, then this, could that sort of save some of that process? Could he give that to other people to help them interpret blood chemistry? And it was Chris who introduced me to his work originally. And I know that Chris went to a course that Bryan gave on blood chemistry interpretation probably about a year ago now. And basically, there were lots of rules and things, and Chris figured, maybe he could implement some of Bryan's rules and help him do this. And there was kind of a process where Bryan kind of was figuring out whether, we would maybe sort of be useful to him, and eventually figured out that, yes, we would be a good team. And then sort of rather than building the sort of the if this then this kind of traditional algorithm, then Chris utilized some of his machine learning analysis that he'd done for some other data that we had at Nourish Balance Thrive to basically predict patterns in biochemistry. So you take some input markers. It's about close to 40 markers, but stuff that almost anybody could get from any doctor. Liver function, kidney function, like a metabolic panel, lipids, a CBC with differential, and an iron panel. That's basically it. And from that, using a number of sets of data we have access to, so some of Bryan's data, some of our data, some more like general health population data, can we predict more complex stuff from the simple stuff? So using just those input markers, we can predict low testosterone or low thyroid or thyroid antibodies or B12 deficiency or folate deficiency or lead exposure or high mercury, sort of a whole host of things that we know are important in terms of both environmental and lifestyle factors. And then we have a combination of, with the input markers themselves, we have some optimal ranges rather than normal. So like the normal range from a lab, everybody knows is basically the mean plus and minus 2 standard deviations. So it's basically 95% of the population who did the test in that lab. But as most people also realize, if you want to be healthy, you don't want to be normal. So you don't want,
Yes.
the normal population, the majority have some kind of metabolic disease in the US. That's just the way things are now. So you don't want to be normal. So we have some optimal reference ranges based on the published literature. And then based on that input data, Chris has built a number of algorithms to predict all this other kind of stuff so that, maybe it's a patient you've been working with for a long period of time and you just don't know where to go next. This could give you some ideas. Maybe you don't want to necessarily start by spending a whole load of money on testing, so you want to sort of some idea of where to go next. And we've also built some scores, so like some validated scores that are very easy to track and sort of give you traction and watch things move over time based on actually a small amount of very cheaply available data. One of them is from something called the Intermountain Risk Score, which is basically an algorithm. You get scores for how your blood values look, and it's very tightly correlated to then later risk of mortality. So that's one of the scores that we've built based on the input data. So there's a combination of different things, and then depending on how your practice looks, or we have a number of super users, just people who want to understand their own biochemistry better. So with a small amount of data and things that you can track very regularly, you can then look at this whole host of other things.
Wow. I'm sitting here and I think I want people to realize the amount of information that you're using and the output of what you're predicting are on two very different scales. Like you just said, you're taking 40 blood chemistry markers, really traditional markers, and I've looked at the math, and you guys had said on your show somewhere between $65 to $100 worth of blood chemistry that you're using to predict things that on the surface seem to have no association. And to me, I was quite fascinated, Chris, when you described this pattern recognition and machine learning software of how you were able to do this type of prediction. Because for me, and Bryan made the jokes on your show, these sort of non-tech people, I don't know how it could be done. And you gave a really good analogy of this sort of pattern recognition. I was curious if you wanted to share that again for our audience in describing this process of how do we even figure out what someone with lead exposure looks like from things that don't seem to have anything to do with lead.
Oh, sure. So I think that humans are really good at recognizing visual patterns. So, for example, I could take a stack of cards, and each one of them has got a picture of either a cat or a dog on the card, and then I could show them to my 4-year-old daughter and say, this one's a cat, this one's a dog, and she'd like look at me funny. Yeah, I know that, Dad. And then I'm like, okay, well, let's do them real fast. You shout out which is a cat and which is a dog, and she would solve that task with close to 100% accuracy, right? Like even a 4-year-old can identify the difference between a cat and a dog. Now try doing the same exercise, but instead of showing pictures of cats and dogs, I'm going to show her, say, 40 markers in blood. So those are just going to be floating point numbers. And then there's going to be the dependent label. So rather than saying, oh, this is a cat and this is a dog, I'm going to say this one has lead exposure and this one doesn't. And then let's repeat the exercise again. So I'm going to keep showing you these blood chemistries, 40 markers on each, 40 floating point numbers. Which one of those has lead exposure and which doesn't? And she would just look at me like, what's a floating point number? Right? Yeah. It's like, and even doctors can't solve this task, right? And so, from working with Bryan and attending his training courses and his online education, I could see that he had a unique ability to interpret blood chemistry. So he would look at a blood chemistry and he'll see patterns that many other doctors won't see. So I'll give you an example. So maybe he would look at a blood test and say, oh yeah, this person is insulin resistant. And he might be looking at fasting glucose. He'd be looking at glycomark. He'd be looking at hemoglobin A1C. He'd be looking at triglycerides, maybe some other markers as well, like bilirubin, uric acid. He has this sixth sense almost to be able to identify oxidative stress and insulin resistance on a blood chemistry that not many other doctors can. But when you say to him, hey, Bryan, can you perform that same test of whether, tell me whether or not this person has lead exposure? Again, you're going to get that same funny look. No, I can't do that. But it turns out that a machine can learn to do that given enough labeled examples. So we had enough labeled examples. So these are people who did a basic blood chemistry, those 40 markers, and they measured their blood level of lead. And then what I did was I showed a model, a machine learning algorithm called XGBoost, tens of thousands of examples of people that either were or weren't exposed to lead. And through that training process, as we call it in data science, the machine learned how to identify somebody that had lead exposure or not. And I'm just using lead as an example here. Tommy mentioned that we can predict lots of things like your nutrient status and your infections and a whole bunch of other things. And they all work in the same way. And that is that they've learned how to identify these patterns by example.
Man, once again, I just, go back to that podcast and that explanation. let people just realize what Chris and Tommy are talking about is really fascinating. So if anyone with you've probably, say a layperson, you've gone to your doctor, and sometimes doctors won't even give you the lab chemistry because they'll just assume that it's more than you want to know.
Right.
And there's probably markers on there that mean very little to both lay people and doctors. MCHC, MCV. What do these things mean on a CBC? What you guys are doing is predicting disease states, which otherwise, even to someone like Bryan Walsh, who's trained in recognizing these patterns, would otherwise go under the radar. And maybe it's 5-10 years later that the person develops diabetes. Yet it was sitting there, right there, on this basic blood chemistry that they were already getting, 5-10 years before, but we didn't pick up on it because it's not something that we can recognize. And this, when we go back to the scalability, instead of thousands of dollars for some tests, what we're talking about is around $100 or less than $100 of blood chemistry to perform this. And would love to maybe explore, we kind of mentioned generally some of the things that you're predicting, and wanted to get your guys' insights of, so as a clinician, we like things to be very, black and white, yes or no. We have algorithms, decision tools to help us decide, do we need to do this test or do we use this medicine? And a lot of people don't like the gray because it makes decisions much more difficult. And you had mentioned you're using maybe a little more binary model of yes or no, is this existing, rather than maybe probabilities or scores, or trying to combine the two. But on the surface, I would be much more interested as a clinician if your blood chemistry can predict a clinical disease state rather than just another blood chemistry marker. And while potentially we need that, I'm visualizing in my head what's really going to be a game changer is not, can you predict, from this blood chemistry that someone's fasting blood sugar is going to be elevated, but can you predict the person who's going to get potentially a diabetic, or is more at risk from microvascular complications related to diabetes or some other clinical disease state? And there's another example I might get into later after I get your guys' insights, but wanted at least to start with, and maybe Tommy, you can weigh in. What are more precisely the types of things that you're predicting, and do they correlate to these clinical disease states, or is it really just still within predicting other blood chemistry markers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and there's kind of two ways to approach that. So yes, it's very important to predict the people who say are going to get microvascular complications from their diabetes, and there's a recent paper that came out, I believe it was in the Lancet, looking at subtypes of type 2 diabetes and then different outcome risks based on those sort of different clusters. And that's not something that we're doing currently, but it's certainly something that could be built in. But equally, we would like to say that we want to pick that stuff up before, you're going to see it. I mean, predicting microvascular complications in somebody who already has diabetes is great, but I want to pick up that person who may get diabetes and intervene much before that even happens. And from that respect, there's certainly a number of things that we can predict that are going to be very useful there. So I can give you some examples, and one of the things that I put together to go in the calculator is a metabolic health score, and it combines a number of things. Inputs that come directly from the blood test, so fasting glucose, triglycerides and HDL transformed into the atherogenic index of plasma, and then there are other things, predictions that come out of the algorithms that are also associated with future risk of metabolic disease. So we could be talking type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's disease for some of them, certainly. And so it's things like elevated homocysteine or elevated ApoB or LDL particle, elevated C-peptide or insulin. All these things that we know are associated with those disease risks. And if you look like somebody who's heading in that direction, you might get a lower score, but we know that as the likelihood of those predictions increases, the number of predictions increases, and the score increases, you're closer to somebody who's going to be at risk of that. So certainly that's part of it, and there are other things that we know are very important, say again for metabolic disease. So ferritin and iron overload, and predicting iron overload or likely iron overload is part of the algorithm. We know if you have a ferritin over 200 and you're a man, then you have an increased risk of all-cause mortality. And we do actually focus on all-cause mortality for a number of things because it's very easy to skew what your recommendations are based on what disease you care about the most. So if we're talking about cardiovascular disease, you get a very skewed idea of how lipids should look. But actually, particularly as you get older, essentially the higher your total cholesterol, the higher your LDL cholesterol, the longer you live. That's just the way it is. So while it's true that as those numbers go up, you do start to see an increase in cardiovascular disease risk, your total mortality risk goes down. So which are you worried about? Are you worried about getting cardiovascular disease? Or if you do everything you can to reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, are you just dramatically increasing your risk of dying of something else, right? So I think that's a big part of it. And we focus on all-cause mortality where we can. But other parts of it are, say, we have an inflammation score, which looks at various parts of input markers. And then we know, based on studies, your likely outcome or your 2-year or 5-year survival of a certain type of cancer is different based on ratios of different lymphocytes, say. So your neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, different types of leukocytes. So a neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, lymphocyte to monocyte ratio, lymphocyte to platelet ratio. Those give you some idea, particularly at diagnosis or when you're undergoing chemotherapy, of your later survival with certain types of cancer. So these things, again, some of them are just basic ratios taken from the input markers, and some of them are predictions taken from the algorithm that are very tightly correlated with outcome in a number of different modern diseases. So depending on how you use the calculator, I think you can pick up all that stuff before it happens, and then you can also determine some factors of risk once that disease is actually in place.
Chris, there are some other things, you mentioned some of these metabolic conditions, which is a huge issue right now. Obesity, diabetes, prediabetes, whatever you want to call it, metabolic syndrome. It's a major concern. And it sounds like this tool is quite incredible for looking into that and giving us a better view of someone who's maybe at higher risk, sooner, so we can really intervene with some of these therapies, lower carbohydrate diets, ketogenic diets, supplementation, what have you. You guys also are looking at some things that are maybe a little more off of the association chart when it comes to these types of blood chemistry. Some of the things you're looking at are actually GI infections, H. pylori, or even exposures to certain heavy metals. And you think, well, if I want to know if I'm exposed to some kind of heavy metal, I should just do the test, right? But this is potentially able to predict exposure or heavy metal toxicity related to mercury or lead. And was curious if you wanted to weigh in on one, what are some of those perhaps less what's the word I'm looking for? Less obvious associations between the blood chemistry and a disease state and some of these other things that you guys are looking at, and what types of controls are you using to sort of verify that, yes, this is someone who has a high lead level, or this is someone who has an amoeba infection on a stool test, or this is someone who has an H. pylori infection on a breath test. What types of controls are you using as the sort of standard of comparison?
Sure. So we have a held out data set. So each one of the tests that we've been talking about in this interview, there is a published specification, sensitivity and specificity. And we know how good each one of these tests are because we hold out at least 20% of the data for testing purposes. So when I said I trained the algorithm by example, I didn't show the algorithm all of the data. I held 20% of it out so that after I finish training the model, I can test the model on the 20% of held out data. And that allows us to compute what we call the sensitivity and the specificity. And I think any of the practitioners listening to this will be familiar with that. And so no test is perfect. There's always a sensitivity and a specificity. And our algorithms are no different. And none of the algorithms are exactly perfect. So lead, for example, it's not perfect. And so really what this is a checklist generator. You could think about it, right? So, okay, this person's just walked into my office and they have metabolic dysfunction. Is heavy metal toxicity a potential concern for them? and you could get that information from a basic blood chemistry. And then you could, as you allude to there in your question, you could just say, well, okay, well, that seems to be a route we should go down, and therefore we should just test directly blood levels of metals. And you could certainly do that. Another thing you could do is some maybe light therapy that would help with the excretion of metals. So one thing we use in our practice quite a lot are sauna therapy, and then some other supplements that can assist in detoxification. And there's really not much of a downside in doing that, other than maybe the time you spend in the sauna and possibly financial on the cost of the supplements. And then you could redo the blood chemistry and then have a look again. How did my prediction for blood levels of lead change? Did it change at all? Did it get better? Did it get worse? And then how did the rest of the blood chemistry change? Like what happened to... So one of the things that we can do using these same machine learning techniques, rather than doing a binary classification, yes or no, we can do a logistic regression and then predict your age. And so you could just do some kind of intervention and then look at your predicted age as a way of keeping progress, keeping score. Or look at the 5-year wellness score, which is the Intermountain Risk Score that Tommy mentioned earlier. And I did that get better after I did some sort of intervention to whatever the prediction was. So yeah, we do know how good the tests are, and that is published on bloodcalculator.com.
And I'd just like to jump in briefly and say that some of the things that we think about in terms of risk factors that we are predicting or creating as a checklist in the calculator, they might be more important than most people take into account. So recently, we're talking about lead. So there's this paper in the Lancet that Chris recently posted on our Slack that looked at low-level lead exposure and mortality in US adults, and they, from their calculations, suggested that the population attributable fraction of the concentration of lead in blood for all-cause mortality was 18%. So, like the amount of lead you're exposed to is 18% of your risk of all-cause mortality, right? That's huge. So, and this is, coming in the water, or, even some places in the world, you're still being exposed to leaded fuels. So just because, most people go, lead, these guys, again, will go down the quack route. This is like a real thing. This is something that people are being exposed to. These are things that the CDC are monitoring because they know it contributes to all-cause mortality. So if you're somebody who's exposed, you want to know about that. But most people who go to their doctor may not get their lead level tested, and we're not suggesting that everybody should get their lead level tested, but you might be able to pick that pattern up in a blood chemistry. So there's certainly some things that people might not normally think about. They're actually quite big factors in terms of their risk of health or disease, and hopefully we can start to predict more and more of these to try and bring those to light where necessary, or where it's going to make a big difference to find.
That is so true, Tommy. I was just actually reading this morning Chris Kresser's article sort of talking about heavy metals and chelation therapy and some of the research behind that. And it was looking at some of those articles he posted. It was quite staggering. Like the percentages you're talking about in this all-cause mortality and these effects on cardiovascular disease were pretty pronounced. And so you're talking about, quite major intervention that could have a, major effect. We're not talking about, adding 2 months to someone's life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about things that are could be pretty major. And, I see this as two potential positives. One, yes, we have sort of a broken system. The insurance model in America is not great. But what you just said is you can take someone who there's almost no way that they will not have a CBC or a CMP covered by their insurance, and get this wealth of information from tests that probably wouldn't be covered, or an insurance company be like, why in the world are you ordering a lead test on this person? And you can at least have some starting ground in an insurance model to see, and I see that's sort of a triage of where should I go next. And then for the functional practitioner, who I think is oftentimes wanting to do more at the beginning than realistically we need to be doing.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
in order to really scale this, much of my motivation is like, what's the smallest amount of testing and intervention I can do, even from a supplement standpoint, to really get this person well and optimal? Because that's how I see this scaling. And this is an incredible tool that's going to help, I think, clinicians as a gateway, because there's so much in the way we're taught in functional medicine is, methylation might be equally as important as detoxification, or as equally as important as the gut. And you can get lost as like, where should I start? This person's got 27 things wrong with them. And so could be an incredible resource in a fairly simplified model to kind of triage and see where do I need to direct my resources next. And as Chris pointed out, man, maybe you don't even do the mercury test or the lead test because you're just going to use the blood chemistry calculator and follow that and track the scores relative to maybe inflammation or one of these other risks using that. And I mean, there's so many possibilities. And I love how you guys are kind of continuing to manipulate some of the data and keeping some of that so you can keep it in an iterative model and keep making it better and more specific and more sensitive for disease states. Because I think as we start to tie in some of these blood markers with other clinical states and get by some researchers and clinicians, I think we're going to get there's the possibility for some amazing data. So I'm really hopeful, and I cannot stress enough to people, this is some incredible stuff that you guys are doing. So I've already taken way too much of your guys' busy days, and so thankful for you both being on here. I wanted to at least spend the last couple minutes giving you guys the opportunity to share any final reflections and how people can who are listening can follow. And perhaps, Chris, you can get us started.
Sure. Final reflections. My goodness. Yeah. So I think the major thing that I see every day with the clients that we work with, the major way that they go wrong is by focusing too much on a single variable. So we just talked about a million different variables in this interview. And if you did the blood chemistry calculator, you'd find another million. And the number one mistake that I see our clients making is to focus too much on one single variable. And I've learned this the hard way too. In the beginning, I thought that I could fix all of my problems just with a dietary intervention. And as it turns out, that was actually a business. That's what we did in the beginning, was just this dietary intervention. And we got great results with that. But as it turns out, there's so many other moving parts. And so that's what my podcast has been, is an exploration of these other very important moving parts that lead to the overall picture of human health and performance. And so, yeah, if I was to leave one parting thing, it would be not to over-focus on a single variable.
Yeah, Tommy, actually, Chris, that's a wonderful insight. I think, especially putting this in context with all of the numbers, all the variables that we're looking at, it can get easy, if your homocysteine comes back at 15, to be completely obsessed with that level,
right,
and forget we're looking at patterns in people and not lab tests. So that's a great final reflection to put that in context. Tommy, any thoughts?
Yeah, that's Chris has given such a good summary that now anything I say is not going to sound nearly as good. But so I think it's important to start out, and so we've had some conversations again around the blood chemistry calculator, and people saying things like you do this stuff, and a lot of these predictions come essentially out of nowhere, and then all of a sudden there's this whole host of stuff that you have to be worried about, and it will, the basics are the basics for a reason. And yes, you can go down various rabbit holes, and that may or may not be important or differingly important in different patients. But the basics are always going to be the most important things. So what we're talking: sleep, stress, movement, and food. That's pretty much it. Various people call it different things, 4 pillars, stuff like that. And that's really where your focus needs to be. And then things like, say, the blood chemistry calculator can allow you to track how you respond to those things. I think that's a nice way to use it. And then you can also, if you don't see the benefits that you need once you've actually, really approached those, the basics, and you've got the lifestyle nailed down, then, have some idea of what to do next. And I kind of was umming and ahhing about whether to talk about this, but certainly if people do end up using, particularly if clinicians end up using the calculator, I think there's an interesting aspect to it that's worth talking about, and it's that we have a lot of people, or not a lot, but some people who've written us back and said, well, you predicted that this was low, but I've measured it and it's not low. And I think that's a really interesting point to start thinking about how you're using this in your diagnostic process. So I think whenever you're using a tool like this, you cannot disengage your brain and just rely on the calculator to tell you what to do. Because I'll give you an example that I was speaking to somebody about this morning. So the calculator predicted that they had low folate, but then when they measured folate in the blood, folate was actually high. And then you can either think, well, the calculator's wrong, the algorithm's wrong, or you can think about, why would somebody who has high blood folate look like somebody who has low folate? Like, what could be going on there? You know, are there issues with the type of supplement they're taking? Are there issues with their DHFR gene or their MTHFR gene? You know, are there other things going on that means that the folate that's clearly floating around is not doing the job that it's supposed to do? And then maybe you go back, you look at some other markers, you look at the MCV and the RDW, and you have some idea of whether, you know, the folate that's there is doing what it's supposed to do. So, you know, there are two kind of parts of my summary. One is that the basics are always the basics, and those are always going to be the most important things. And then, if you are starting to use tools, and it could be any test, any in-depth biochemistry, you know, or something that's algorithm-based, like the biochemistry calculator, is that as a clinician, particularly because I know that's the audience listening, is you cannot disengage the diagnostic process. You cannot disengage that part of the brain. You still need cortical input in order to, you know, really get the best out of the information and then use it to give your patients the best results. So that's my rambling twofold summary.
That for people listening, that was an incredible insight. And I'm sitting here thinking, you know, the best example I can think of statistically is this concept of positive predictive value. You know, you need to be asking some kind of question when you're doing this. I mean, there are screening tests which are sort of maybe, you know, used as a true screen, but we need to be asking some type of question from this test, and you know, picking and selecting patients who we think are going to come up with something. And then you're right, once we've gotten the output, let's put our thinking cap back on and not just assume like the computer told me this. You know, let's put that in clinical context. So that was a really helpful insight, and I hope people take that as well as the bigger picture concept of, you know, what we're looking at in terms of these just overall patterns and really the types of questions we're, you know, seeking at answering. You know, you guys are doing as wonderful a job as possible to make this as potentially black and white or, you know, yes or no as possible, but really we're still in something that's so new, right? This is really this amazing new experiment, a new way of looking at health and trying to predict things that otherwise at this, you know, point we really don't have a kind of similar technology that's doing this. So really cutting edge stuff that you guys are doing. Well, Chris, Tommy, this has been, like I said, awesome. I still just blown away by your guys' generosity, and really hope that we can meet in a few months. I know you guys mentioned you'll be up at the Ancestral Health Symposium in a few months. So really look forward to hopefully meeting you guys there. Why don't you guys at least, you know, let people know who are listening how they can follow you or follow podcasts or what you guys are doing in terms of a presence online.
Yeah, nourishbalancethrive.com is the main website, and you'll find the podcast link from there. And that's a great place to get to know us. Both Tommy and me, we regularly do interviews with experts on a broad range of topics. And then if you're interested in the blood chemistry calculator, it's bloodcalculator.com is the URL. And then, yeah, come meet us in Bozeman, Montana, isn't it, at the Ancestral Health Symposium.
Montana.
Yeah, it's in Montana. So I'm really excited about, I love that conference. I've loved it for many years. Missed it, unfortunately, last year because we were in Iceland for a different conference that was also amazing. So yeah, very excited to go to the Ancestral Health Symposium, and I'd encourage anybody listening to come and see us there.
Yeah, Tommy, wanted to share with people anything else that you're up to over the next few months, or any way they can get in touch with your work.
Yeah, that's definitely the highlights in terms of, and actually speaking of highlights, I have an email series called Highlights that people can sign up for. You can do that on the.
Oh yes.
Oh, wasn't that a smooth transition? That was.
Oh, that was perfect.
That was beautiful,
and
yeah.
It's wonderful. It is. I've loved it. So, Tommy, explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. So this is basically my weekly email series, and if people are up to date on that, they'll have noticed that they haven't had an email for a couple of months, just because I was finishing my last job and setting up the blood calculator and stuff, but it will start again this week as we record. So sorry about that, but it's basically three things that sort of come up in an email, and one is like one simple evidence-based piece of advice for something you can integrate into your life to improve your health and well-being. One thing that sort of cropped up in usually the health and wellness world that we'd like to give a different perspective on, just based on, you know, biochemistry, physiology, why we think that's probably not the right way to think about things, or why we might give a differing opinion, say. And then just like usually some awesome stuff, and it's, you know, funny articles or funny videos or just, you know, other people doing cool stuff. So like you doing your podcast, maybe that'll make an appearance and that kind of stuff. So,
man.
good, people that we like doing good stuff, and we don't pretend that we're the only people with the answers, and there's loads of great people out there doing great stuff. So we like to share that too. So that's an email that people can sign up for. And then just very briefly, I was recently voted as, voted last year. I came in as the president of Physicians for Ancestral Health, which is a society for doctors, MDs and DOs who are interested in the kind of ancestral health world, want to connect with other guys doing similar stuff, want to know how maybe they can integrate some of this stuff into their practice. We've just started a podcast. The first episode will be live for members. Actually, it just went live today for members. We love to meet like-minded people, and hopefully, I know there are some practitioners or students. So if you're an MD or DO student, you're very welcome to be a member too, and membership is much reduced as a student. Please, you can go to the website. It's ancestraldoctors.org. If you email through there, it will go to me, and we can, be nice to just talk to people. And if people want to become members, we have a great meeting in January every year. Next year in 2019, it's going to be in Scottsdale, Arizona. So come, there's some great talks, and it's just great to sort of meet like-minded physicians. So that's kind of one of my side things that, particularly for the audience to this podcast, I think it would be great if they're interested.
Definitely. I think, more and more I want, the next generation of physicians, younger physicians like myself, to be passionate and join these types of groups. I will be honest and say I felt a little lonely in some of these places, looking around and looking for people my age or at my level of training and have the same passion. And I wish there were more people. So anyone listening, definitely explore it. This is a great group of people.
Yeah, I was going to tell you, every time, every year new members turn up to the winter retreat in wherever we have it. And one of the first things they say is, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only person.
Yeah.
So there are so many people who think that way, but you're not the only one. So come and join us.
Awesome. Well, Chris, Tommy, thanks again. This has been an absolute blast. Can't wait to meet you guys in person. So thank you.
Likewise, thank you
for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.